So today I'm going to be walking through how to make this tie strap shirred back top. I also have this pattern available as a dress and a jumpsuit, and all of those patterns are available on my store, which is linked down below. I've tried to keep everything as beginner friendly as possible, so let's get on with the tutorial. So this is everything that you're going to need for this particular tutorial. So you will need a woven fabric. This is cotton poplin that I'm using, which works really well. I'm also going to be using some picot elastic around my straps, but that is optional, so you can skip that if you want, or you can use lace or whatever you can get your hands on. You're going to need some thread, some pins, a tape measure and a ruler, some shearing elastic for the back of the top. You will need some fabric pens or some tailor's chalk, fabric scissors or a rotary cutter, and an iron. So I'm going to be using two sewing machines for this project. My regular machine, which is one of the Singer heavy duty machines, and my overlocker. You may also know of this as a serger, and I'm using the Brother Lock 734DS. This is optional. If you don't have one of these, don't worry, you can just use the zigzag stitch on your regular machine instead. The pattern that I'm going to be using is called my Flora pattern, and this pattern has two pieces. So you've got the front of the top, which you need to cut two, but you need to cut them on the fold. And then I have pattern piece 2, which is the back of the top, which again you need to cut 2 and you need to cut those on the fold. So now you can move on to start cutting out your pieces, but first you want to make sure your fabric is laid out correctly. So you want to find the selvage edge of your fabric, which is the finished edge. So you should be able to see that you have an edge that is finished so that it doesn't fray like your other edges. Just zoom in slightly. So hopefully you can see that this edge is the finished edge, which is your selvage edge, and then this edge along here is still a raw edge, so it frays quite easily. So you want to find the two selvage edges of your fabric. So I've got two here, and fold the fabric with those two selvage edges, one on top of the other. So now I've got my selvage edge here, two selvage edges on top of each other, and then my fold over at the other side. So now I can start to draw my pattern pieces out, and the first thing you would normally do is to find this grain line and make sure that that grain line is parallel to your selvage edge. But because both of these pieces are lined up to the fold, once you line them up to that fold, that grain line will be parallel to the selvage edge by default. So I'm just going to line both of those up, and then once you've got them laid out, you can go ahead and draw them in place. I'll just need to draw both of those out twice. So once all of your pieces are drawn out, I'm going to take some pins and I'm just going to pin within those lines that I've drawn. This is just going to make sure that when you cut them out that you get two identical pieces on each side. And once those pins are in place, you can go ahead and cut your pieces out, just being very careful to make sure that you cut through both layers of the fabric. The final thing that you need to cut out are your straps, and these can be whatever size you want. I like to go for 2 inches wide for each one and 15 inches long. I find that that works really well, and you will need 8 in total for your straps. I'm working with 2 layers of fabric again, so I only needed to draw 4 out. So I'm going to add some pins and cut these out in exactly the same way as I have with the rest of my pieces. At this point you should have all of your pattern pieces cut out, so you should have 2 pieces for the back of your top, 8 pieces for your straps, and 2 pieces for the front of the top. So I'm going to start by making the strap. So for my straps, I've got 2 of my 8 pieces here, and I've also just cut a couple of pieces of that elastic that I'm going to add to be the same size as those long edges. Again, you don't need to do this, you can skip this part, but if you do want to add these, I'm just going to lay them onto those straps, lining up the straight edge of the elastic to the straight edge of the strap. I'm just going to lay them like this. If your fabric has an obvious right or wrong side, you want to be adding these to the right side of the fabric. So just like that. And again, skip that if you don't want to add any elastic or lace or anything. And then take your second strap and lay it right sides facing together with the other strap on top of all of those pieces. And now I'm just going to take some pins and I'm going to pin along both of the long edges and along one of the 2 short edges. And then once those pins are in place, you can go and sew each of those edges. So along both of the long edges and the one short edge that you've got, making sure to leave one of the short edges open because we're going to use that to turn the strap to the right side out. I'm going to use my overlocker just because it tends to be a little bit easier when you've sandwiched some elastic or lace in there, but you can just use a standard straight stitch as well. So once you've got those seams sewn in place, you can start to turn the strap to the right side out. One thing that I did forget to mention is that if you are using some lace or elastic or anything to trim your straps with, I would recommend sewing both of the long edges in place and then the short edge at the end. That just makes sure that whatever you've trimmed your strap with gets kind of tucked under and you don't have any raw edges. So I'll show you what I mean when I've turned this to the right side. So this is how my strap is looking. Hopefully you can see what I mean about how that trim gets kind of folded over rather than having a raw edge like it does down here. Now the only thing left to do with this strap is to add a top stitch to make sure that the strap sits nice and flat. So I'm literally just going to sew up both of those long edges with a straight stitch. I'm not going to do either of the ends because you don't need to, just up both of those long edges. So this is how that top stitch should look, and then once you've done that, you just want to repeat the same steps for your remaining straps so that you have 4 identical straps. Now you can put these to one side and start working on the top. So I'm going to start by working on the front of the top, and the first thing we need to do is to add the darts. Now darts are just a fold in your garment to create a bit more shape. And you can see on the pattern, the dart here is this triangle. So we want to add that to both sides of this pattern because obviously it was cut out on the fold, and the easiest way to transfer the lines of that dart onto your fabric is to just cut this out from the pattern. And now I can grab my fabric pen and just draw those new lines onto the wrong side of my fabric. And it should look something like that, and then I'm just going to flip the pattern and draw my second dart in place. So once those darts are drawn in place, the next step is to create the folds and start to pin them in place. I'm just going to zoom in slightly. So I'm going to fold the piece with right sides facing together so that these two lines lay one on top of the other. So we're just folding down the center of that dart, and then start to pin that in place. The first place that I like to add a pin is just at the end here. And then the rest of the pins are going to come along this line here. These are called the legs of the dart. So I'm going to place the pin through the line on one side, and then I'm going to check if it goes through the line on the other side, which for that one it does, so that's perfect. And then just continue with the rest of that line. Again, placing the pin through the line on one side and checking if it goes through the line on the other side, which it does. And then placing that final pin. And again, that goes through on one side and goes through on the other side as well. I'm just going to show you slightly closer up as well. So I've got all the pins going through the line of that dart on one side, but also along the other side. So I'm just going to repeat that for my second dart. And once those two darts are pinned in place, you want to sew along those lines with a straight stitch. I'm going to show you exactly how to do that on my machine. So I've just got my machine set up to a standard straight stitch. I'm going to start to sew along one of those lines, just taking that first pin out. I'm going to make sure I'm nicely lined up and put the needle down, and then I'm just going to start by reversing just to secure that stitch at that end, and then I'm just going to follow along the rest of this line. Take that next pin out. And as we come to this point here, I'm not going to reverse, I'm just going to sew straight off the end, and then I'm going to tie that off. So make sure you leave enough of a tail that you can tie it in a couple of knots. just sew straight off. I'm just going to trim that. So I've got my dart here, and then I've got these threads at the point of the dart. I'm just going to tie this in a couple of knots. And then trim that off. And then I'm just going to go in and repeat that for my second dart. And that's how those darts should be looking once they're sewn in place. The final thing I'm going to do with these darts is to just press them flat. I like to press mine towards my armholes. And then the same on this side. And then you just want to repeat that for your remaining piece of the front of the top. And now I'm going to move on to prepare the back of the top. So for the back of the top, the first thing I'm going to do is to just mark on this guide here that's going to show us where to attach the straps to. So I need to mark that onto both sides because obviously this was cut on the fold. Just mark it there and then flip the pattern and mark it on this side as well. So then once you have that guide in place, the next thing that we're going to do is add a guide to follow for the shirring. So firstly, I'm going to mark out the spacing of those lines. So I'm going to start about 1.5 centimeters from the top. And then just from that mark there, I'm just going to mark in centimeter intervals. And then once you get to the last section down here, you just want to leave a bit of a gap for seam allowance. So I'm leaving about 2 centimeters, 1.5 would be good as well, just anything more than 1 centimeter down at the bottom. And then I'm just going to repeat this on the other side. And then once you've drawn out that spacing on both sides, I'm just going to join them up with a straight line. And I forgot to mention this should all be going onto the right side of your fabric. So the marks for the straps and the shirring lines all want to go onto the right side of the fabric. So make sure you're either using a tailor's chalk or a water soluble fabric pen, something that you're going to be able to get rid of eventually. Just continuing to work through each of those marks until you've filled the whole piece. And then once you've got that guide drawn in place, you can move over to your machine to start adding the shirring. If you're new to shirring, you might want to practice on some scraps first. So firstly, we need to set up our machine so that we can use shirring elastic in it. So I've got the top of my machine threaded up as normal, just with normal thread through the needle. I've got my machine set to a straight stitch and I'm going to up the length to the highest length possible, which is a 4 on my machine. And then we also need to wind some bobbins. So you can see here, I've just wound some of this elastic onto a bobbin. I'll just grab an empty one. And you want to do this by hand, you don't want to do this on your machine. Literally just want to wind that round the bobbin. Try not to stretch it. And then once you have that elastic wound onto the bobbin, you want to load it into your machine as you would with any other bobbin. I'm just going to pick that up with my thread and pull it out of the way. And then once you've got your machine set up, you can just start to sew your lines in place. So again, sewing onto the right side of the fabric. I just like to reverse at the start to make sure that stitch is as secure as possible. And also reversing at the end and trimming that off. And you'll be able to see that the piece is starting to kind of bunch together, which is what the shirring is going to do. I'm just going to continue sewing down each of those lines that I've drawn. and that's the second line sewn in place. It's going to start to gather more and more the more of these lines that you sew in place. So your piece will be much smaller when you get to the end of all these lines. I'm going to do the rest of mine off camera. The shirred panel should roughly half in length. If it doesn't, you may need to change some of the settings on your machine. So your back panel should be looking something like this when you've done sewing those lines. It should be nice and stretchy, and you want to repeat that for your remaining panel for the back of the top so that you have 2 shirred panels. And now you can put these to one side for the time being. So now that you've got all of your individual pieces made, you can start to put everything together. So starting with the front of the top, I'm going to take one of my pieces and then lay my second piece one on top of the other with right sides facing together. Just match up those corresponding edges, and then I'm going to pin around the armhole on both sides. And I'm just going to sew around both of those armholes with a straight stitch. And once those armholes are sewn in place, I want to grab 2 of my straps, and I'm going to place these straps in between the 2 layers of my top and just line up that raw edge of the strap to the neckline of the top. And you can pin these straps wherever you like, but I like to keep mine nice and close to that armhole. So I'm going to pin mine in place there. I like to have my strap poking out slightly because it makes sure that you don't miss any of the strap when you're sewing it in place. And pin it at the top here. I like to pin it at the bottom here to make sure that it stays facing straight down, and I'm going to do the same with my second strap. And then once those straps are pinned in place, I'm just going to pin the rest of the way along that neckline. And now you can sew straight across the top of that neckline, just being very careful to make sure that you get both layers of the top and also the straps included in that seam. So just straight across here. So I've just finished sewing across that neckline, and I've also just trimmed off the excess of that dart. You just want to fold these straps out the way and pin along that bottom edge. And I'm just going to sew along that bottom edge with a straight stitch, and this is going to be your waistline. So once I've sewn that bottom edge in place, the front of the top is pretty much done. The only other thing that you might want to do is to finish off these edges with an overlocker or a zigzag stitch. I would mainly recommend that if you're using a fabric that frays quite easily. Otherwise, I'm going to move on to the back of the top. So I'm going to take one of my back pieces and my 2 remaining straps. I'm going to find that guide that I left to tell me where to attach those straps, and I'm going to attach the center of the strap to that guide. If you want to find the exact center of the strap, you can fold them in half and pin that in place. I'm just going to do that with my second strap as well. And then I'm going to take the second piece of the back of the top and lay that on top of all those pieces with right sides facing together. I'm just going to pin it in place at a few points. So firstly, at this side seam, just at the very top here. So pin it in place there. I'm going to pin all the way through the strap and the piece that we've got at the back here, and then I can remove this first pin. I'm going to do the same on the other side. So starting right at that side seam. And then pinning all the way through those pieces, just trying to make sure that that guide for the strap lines up. And then I'm just going to put a pin roughly at the center as well. I might have to move that. So now I'm going to sew right across this top edge, and as you're doing this, because of the shirring, you will have to stretch the piece, which is why I've not put many pins in place. Like I said, you might have to move some of the pins while you're sewing, but they might help initially. I'll show you exactly how I'm going to do it on my machine. So I've got my machine set up to a straight stitch. I've just changed the length back down to 2.5, which is the standard length that I use. And I'm just going to start to sew along that top edge. Taking out that first pin, I'm going to reverse at the start. So as you stretch, you want to make sure the needle is down in the fabric. So I'm just going to stretch between each pin that I've added. And just be very careful as you're coming over these straps to make sure that you're getting everything in your seam. Just going to remove that center pin. The trickiest thing about this, I find normally, is to keep the 2 layers of fabric together while you are stretching. So just make sure that you really take your time and do a small section at a time. Just coming up to that second strap, again, make sure you're very careful to get all layers. And reversing at the end. And then before you move on, I would really recommend going in and checking you haven't missed anything in that seam, because it can be quite easy to do. I think mine looks okay for now. So hopefully you can just about see where I've sewn across the top. And now we're going to repeat exactly the same thing we did with the front of the top, where we folded the straps inside and sewed along that bottom edge. So I've just folded those straps out the way and pinned them in place just to make this bit a bit easier. And I'm going to do a similar thing that I did with the top edge here and just pin a couple of points in place. So the side seam on both sides and roughly at the center. You can just go in and sew along that bottom edge the same way that we did with the top, so just stretching as you go along. And then once you've got this bottom edge sewn in place, you can, like I said with the front of the top, go in and finish off those edges with an overlocker or a zigzag stitch, especially if you have a fabric that frays quite easily. And now we can start to put the front of the top and the back of the top together. So the first thing I'm going to do is to just turn my back piece to the right side out. I've still got those straps pinned in place. So this is roughly how your top should be looking. I'm actually going to keep these straps pinned in place just because it will make the next step a little bit easier. And I'm going to grab back the front of the top as well. And for this piece, you want to keep it inside out. And I'm going to take the back piece, which should be the right way out, and I'm going to place it inside the front of the top. And now you want to start to match up those side seams. So I'm going to start with this side, and I would recommend using a lot of pins for this. Just zoom in slightly. This is probably one of the most fiddly parts of the construction in my opinion, but it's more that it just takes a while to get everything pinned in place. So it's not particularly difficult, it's just a bit fiddly. I always like to place my pins at the two extremes first and then start to fill things in. And you will be pinning through 4 layers of fabric here. So that's how your side seam should be looking once it's all pinned in place. I'm now going to repeat that for the other side. So once the second side seam is pinned in place, you will find that the front of the top kind of starts to bunch up. And that's because when the back panel isn't stretched, it will now be smaller than the front panel. So don't panic if your top is looking like this. That is the correct way for it to look. So now I'm just going to sew those side seams in place with a straight stitch. So just sewing straight down each of those side seams. I would really recommend taking your time with this. It's so easy for one of the layers to pull out of the way, especially the ones with the shirring. So just go really, really slowly with this, especially with taking your pins out. So once you've got those side seams in place, there's only a couple of steps left. So the next one is to turn the top to the right side out. You'll need to just unpick a small hole in the armpit, and we're going to use that to turn it to the right side out. So I've got my hole here, but before I start to pull anything through that hole, I'm just going to reinforce the stitch on either side of the hole. So I'm just going to sew over it and reverse a couple of times on each side. And once you've got that hole reinforced on either side, I'm just going to start to gently pull the top through. And then once it's turned to the right side out, it will look something like this. And the next step is going to be to close up this hole. But first, I'm just going to give this a bit of a press. That's looking much better now. So I'm going to close up this hole with a ladder stitch by hand. So for that ladder stitch, you want to fold that seam in on itself and just alternate between each side with one stitch. So one stitch on this side, and then trying to keep it as parallel as possible, coming over to this side, and then going back to the other side, again, keeping it as parallel as possible, and then just keep going with those stitches until you've done the whole length of the hole. And then I like to come back on myself to make sure that that hole is nice and secure. So I'm just going to keep going with one stitch on each side until I get to down here, and then I'm going to come back and I'm going to tie it off at the top. And once you've sewn up that hole, the top is finished.